One of the best wide-angle lenses that Nikon has ever made is this 20mm f1.8 DSLR lens. It came out back in 2014, it's got excellent reviews, including from us, and now Nikon has released a mirrorless lens with the exact same focal length and aperture. This is the Nikon Z 20mm f1.8s. And actually, if you hold up these two lenses side by side, their constructions are actually kind of similar. They both have this tapered section at the top, and you could be forgiven for thinking that Nikon just threw an adapter on the back of this lens so that it works with their mirrorless system. But that's definitely not the case. Whatever similarities there might be between these lenses, the mirrorless one has a completely different optical design. And the point of this review is just to figure out how good that new design is and whether you should get the Z 20mm f1.8 if you shoot with the Nikon Z system. Now, I've used both of these lenses side by side extensively and taken a bunch of test photos. I've also compared the 20mm Z against another Z lens that you might be considering, the 14 to 30mm f4. And that's in addition to all the testing that we've done in the lab to figure out the exact performance of this lens. So if you want a comprehensive review of the Z 20mm f1.8, you've come to the right place. Here are the lens's specifications. They're actually a little bit higher end than you might expect from an f1.8 prime lens, especially the 3 aspherical and 3 extra low dispersion glass elements. But when you actually hold this lens in person, it feels very similar to most of Nikon's other Z lenses. It does still have that plastic construction, right? You can kind of hear, but it's pretty high quality plastic and it definitely doesn't feel like it's cheaply made. Now the lens also has a switch on the side for autofocus versus manual focus, as well as a fluorine-coated front element to help repel dust and water. And I've put all the specifications for this lens, as well as the DSLR 20mm 1.8 in the description of this video, so feel free to check that out if you want a reference. But for a lot of photographers, something that they really care about is weight. This lens weighs 505 grams, aka 1.1 pounds, which is actually a little bit heavier than the DSLR version of the lens. That one weighs 355 grams. Either way though, this is not a very heavy lens and it's pretty easy to carry around for a day of landscape photography, which is actually what I'm doing right now. Let's start by talking about focusing. In terms of autofocus, the Z 20mm 1.8 is very fast, very accurate. I don't know exactly what Nikon has up their sleeve, but I do know that when we're in the lab testing these lenses, we can autofocus on test charts with the Z system and get perfectly sharp results. That's literally not possible with a DSLR system. Even in live view, the accuracy just isn't good enough. And admittedly, this does have to do just as much with the camera as the lens, but either way, it's one of my favorite things about the Nikon Z system, and this 20mm 1.8 functions the exact same way. In fact, while I was out testing this lens against the DSLR lens, which I'd adapted to the camera, periodically the camera would say that my DSLR lens was taking pictures that were in focus, but when I zoomed in on them, the pictures definitely had some low-lying blur. They weren't wildly out of focus, but there was a little bit of sharpness that was lacking, and when I manually focused to adjust it, I actually got a little bit better results. With the Z lens, that never happened, and I got sharp results every single time. Now, in terms of manual focus, things are a little bit different, because manual focus with these lenses is a little bit iffy, and that's because of the focus-by-wire system. To be specific, the focusing ring on this lens is not actually coupled mechanically to the elements inside the lens, and this has a few interesting effects. First, if you just turn off the camera and you rotate the focusing ring, nothing inside the lens is going to move. And this is very different from most of Nikon's DSLR lenses. More importantly though, the actual spot that you focus on manually doesn't just depend on where the ring is positioned, but also how fast you turn it. And at least for me, this makes it a little bit more difficult to pinpoint focus on the spot that I want. Worst of all though, is every single time that you turn off the camera and then turn it back on again, focus resets to approximately infinity. This is a bit of a problem because if you've manually focused on your foreground, but then you turn off the camera and turn it back on, you're going to reset focus and you might not even realize it. This is why I personally don't like these focus-by-wire systems nearly as much for manual focus. Now they do work amazingly well for autofocus, they've got all the benefits that I talked about a moment ago, but for manual focus, they definitely come with some compromises. And that's not to say that you can't take sharp manual focus photos with this lens, but you just have to be a bit more careful about it and it might not be as comfortable or ergonomic. Now, let's talk about close focusing. Not a lot of photographers out there are going to buy a 20mm lens for close-up photography, and this lens really isn't an exception, but it does have a pretty decent maximum magnification of 1:5. And that means that if you're using a full-frame camera sensor, you can fill the frame with something that's about 5 inches across. And that means that if you're photographing flowers or lizards or maybe even some larger insects, you will be able to get some decent photos with it. So it's not like I would recommend this lens for macro photography, but at least you have the option there if you want it. Now, the moment that you've all been waiting for, let's talk about sharpness. In order to figure out just how sharp this 20mm 1.8 lens really is, we've actually done some testing in the lab on a test chart to figure out its exact sharpness characteristics. And I'm going to show you those results in a minute, but first I want to demonstrate how sharp it is compared to some of its competitors on a real-world landscape. Now, before I show you those photos, I do want to explain a couple things about my setup. First, even though it's really not very windy, I've just collapsed the thinnest leg section on each leg of my tripod just in case. On top of that, I'm shooting base ISO, I'm shooting RAW, and I'm actually using the electronic shutter rather than mechanical just to avoid any possibility of blur. I've even set a self-timer of 2 seconds so that my thumb or my finger won't actually cause any vibration that shows up in the photo. In short, I've done everything that I possibly could to take the sharpest possible pictures so that the only differences between them are thanks to the lens and the aperture that I'm using. Now, along those same lines, the two areas that I'm going to be comparing in my photo are the center and the top corner, both of which are at infinity, so there's no issue here with depth of field. And of course there is a bit of foreground in this photo, my shadow's even showing up there, but I'm not going to be comparing sharpness in that spot, so you can basically ignore it. And I won't really know how sharp these photos are until I'm back at my computer, so I'm going to go home, load those photos, and I'll meet you there. Now I've opened my post-processing software, and here's what I'm seeing. In the center of these photos, the Nikon Z 20mm lens is extremely sharp. By comparison, here's how the older DSLR 20mm lens looked. You can see it's just a huge difference. And yes, this is perfect focus on both photos. I made absolutely certain of it when I was taking these pictures in the field. And in fact, the second photo really isn't all that blurry by normal standards. If you add just a little bit of sharpening to this, you can print it extremely large. And if your monitor right now is showing those photos at about 15 inches wide, it's like looking at a crop from a 5-foot wide print. So these magnifications right now are absolutely huge, and I'm doing that just to show you every little bit of difference between the sharpness of these lenses. Now let's take a look at the corners, which also show a significant difference between these two lenses. Here's the 20mm DSLR lens, and here is the 20mm Nikon Z lens. Obviously, again, there is a difference. The Nikon Z lens is significantly sharper, but actually I think that the differences were even stronger when you looked at the center of the image. So let's move on to the next aperture. We'll check out f4. Here we are. Now at this point by f4, you would expect that most lenses out there are pretty sharp, especially in the center, and that's completely true here. When I zoom in on the center of these photos, this is the 20mm Z lens, and it's incredibly sharp. And by comparison, even though the DSLR lens is still a hair less sharp, it still looks extremely good. And let's also bring in a third lens, the 14 to 30mm f4, which is another wide-angle Z lens. And again, looking at the center at f4, I really think that it's about as sharp as the 20mm Z lens. And that's a big credit to the zoom lens. Usually zooms are going to be a little bit softer at their widest aperture, and this lens really isn't. So props to Nikon for making a really high-quality zoom. Now let's take a look at the corners though. These are still the f4 photos. When I zoom all the way in at the corner here, with the 20mm f1.8 Z lens, you can see that it's not totally sharp, and there's actually a little bit of chromatic aberration in some of these areas here. But actually, compared to the 14 to 30mm lens, it is a little bit sharper. You can see there's that comparison one more time, and when you compare both of them against the older 20mm lens, it's clear that both of Nikon's new mirrorless lenses are sharper than that old 20mm lens. Although frankly, even the image from the old 20mm can be printed huge right now, and it would still look really good. Now let's take a look at f8, and most of the time you won't even be able to see very big differences between high quality lenses at f8, and that's pretty much true here. Especially when I look in the center, I genuinely cannot tell which of these three lenses is the sharpest. They look pretty much identical to me. However, if I look in the corners, it is a little bit of a different story. Let me jump to the corner right up here. Now right now I'm looking with the Nikon 20mm DSLR lens, but I can also go back to the 14 to 30 and then the Z lens. And between the three of them, I do think that the Z is ever so slightly sharper than the 14 to 30, which itself is ever so slightly sharper than the older 20. But again, all of these differences are so small that it pretty much doesn't matter. If you've got good technique and you shoot at f8, you're not going to run into sharpness issues. In fact, the only real difference that I see here is that there's a little bit more chromatic aberration on the older 20mm lens compared to the 14-30 and especially compared to the new 20mm. But that's something that you can correct really easily in almost any editing software, and at these low levels you're never going to notice any residual effects. Now, I did say that I'd pop up the test chart results for these lenses, and here they are. They really tell a very similar story to the real-world photos. The Nikon Z is definitely sharper than its competitors, especially compared to the older 20mm lens wide open at f1.8. And you'll notice that I've also popped up the chart for the Z 24mm f1.8. I didn't have it with me to test, and it's not even the same focal length, but if you're considering one of these lenses, you might be considering the other, so there it is. Also, keep in mind that test charts are at a closer focusing distance than infinity, and lenses do tend to perform a little bit different depending on how far away you focus. In this case, it doesn't really matter. There's no major discrepancies between the test chart results and the real-world photos, but if you ever do see any, that's probably the reason why. Now, the last thing that I want to show you is some Milky Way photography, because that really brings out the difference between different lenses. Here's the full image. I took this one with the Z lens, and then a crop from the top corner, same as before. To me, it looks really good. If you do any Milky Way photography, you'll know that it's difficult to get sharp, pinpoint stars, especially in the corner, just because of lens issues like Coma. However, in this case, the stars look almost like perfect dots, and this is a really sharp result. By comparison, the DSLR 20mm f1.8 has always been just okay in terms of Coma performance. You can definitely see that in this case it's significantly worse than the Z lens, although even this is not that bad of a result. Now, if you don't know what Coma is, it really appears as kind of this X-shaped blur in bright points of light. It's especially common in the corners, and you definitely can see it here, but just to put things into perspective, let me pop up that photo from the older lens full screen. Now, even if you're watching this video at maximum 4K resolution, you're hardly going to see any Coma at this magnification. So when I talk about all these differences between lenses, they're not huge differences. That photo exaggerated things as much as possible. It's pretty much a worst case scenario for the old lens, and it still looks pretty good. And that's what I want you to keep in mind when I say that the Nikon Z 20mm 1.8 has simply incredible sharpness. Not just that, it's actually the single sharpest wide-angle lens that we've ever tested in the lab, and we've tested dozens of lenses from a bunch of different manufacturers. Now, sharpness, of course, isn't the only thing that matters in a lens, and if your technique isn't absolutely perfect, you're not going to be able to tell that it's any better than the others. But if you get everything else right, the Nikon Z 20mm lens can give you that last 5%. Whether or not it matters is completely up to you, but there's no denying that that lens is extremely sharp. So next I'm going to talk about flare, which is also something that a lot of landscape photographers care about, so let's take a look. Here you can see a series of photos that I took at different apertures and different positions of the sun. I'm going to pop them all up full screen. Now, this is how the 20mm Z lens looks in terms of flare. It's pretty good, but you can definitely tell that there's some flare, especially the more that you stop down, and particularly when the sun is in the corner. And here's how it compares to the DSLR 20mm 1.8 under the same conditions. Between the two of them, the mirrorless lens does perform a little bit better, but neither one of them is particularly great here. So if you do need to have the sun this bright in your photo, you'll probably just want to use a slightly wider aperture. At a wider aperture, both of these lenses look a little bit better. Now, when the sun is a little bit out of the frame, you definitely want to use a lens hood with the 20mm 1.8 Z. Here's a comparison starting with the lens hood and then without. You can see that the photo with the lens hood definitely has more contrast. So when you're taking landscape pictures, you definitely should be using a lens hood whenever you can. Now, when the sun's in your photo, another effect that you might care about is that sunstar effect. It kind of looks like this with the different rays of the sun spreading out across the photo, and every lens kind of looks a little bit different in terms of its sunstar effect. Now, between these two lenses, here's how the Z 20mm lens looks, and then this is the DSLR 20mm lens. Between the two of them, the DSLR 20mm lens gives the sun a really impressive star effect, whereas with the Z lens, the rays of the sun are definitely a little bit more diffuse, and they're kind of larger and more awkward. They just don't look as good. And this is definitely not something that every photographer cares about, but if you do, it is pretty clear that the older DSLR lens outperforms the newer lens in terms of sunstars. And that's not a huge surprise because the older lens is one of the best lenses out there for sunstar effects. but it can be a little bit of a disappointment if you were hoping that the new lens stacked up just as well. Now let's talk about distortion. In terms of distortion, the new Z lens has about minus 1.94% barrel distortion, and that means that if you put the horizon near the very top of your photo, it'll be a little bit bulged towards the top and kind of falling off towards the sides. It's really not the end of the world, and roughly 2% barrel distortion really isn't all that high. However, by comparison, the older 20mm lens only had about 1% barrel distortion, so it is a little bit higher on the new lens. Either way though, you probably won't even notice it because most post-processing software, including Lightroom and Nikon's own post-processing software, automatically fix distortion whenever you load your photos. It's only something that you'll notice if you open it in certain software that doesn't automatically apply these corrections. And interestingly enough, even once you've corrected for distortion, the new lens is actually a little bit wider angle than the old lens. It's not a massive difference, but I will be able to show it to you in some photos in a minute. For now, let's talk about vignetting. Here's some example photos of how the old lens and the new lens fare in terms of vignetting when both of them are shot at f1.8. Keep in mind that these photos really exaggerate things because I'm shooting a featureless subject and I'm overlaying these photos on a gray field. That said, the new lens does have some vignetting issues. In fact, it's actually about 1/3 of a stop worse than the old lens, for a total of about 2.3 stops of vignetting. This is definitely high, but it's not surprising given that the lens is a wide angle and an f1.8. And of course, once you stop down, you are going to see less vignetting. As you can see here, it definitely improves. But there's no denying that between the two lenses, the new one is worse in terms of vignetting, so at least keep that in mind. Now let's take a look at some chromatic aberration samples. Here, I photographed this tree specifically to see how much chromatic aberration I could capture, and the answer really is not very much. This is a worst case scenario. Tree branches show chromatic aberration like crazy, and you basically can't see any of it here. The new lens controls these chromatic aberrations extremely well. However, this is just lateral chromatic aberration. There's also longitudinal chromatic aberration, which is where out of focus areas in your photo can change color a little bit. And there's a little bit of longitudinal chromatic aberration on this lens. Here's one sample photo that kind of shows it. And you can see here that this background blur definitely has a little bit of a greenish colored ring around it. It's not super obvious, but it's definitely there. So it's not going to ruin your photos, but you definitely might notice it if you look closely at those out of focus backgrounds. Now that basically does it for image quality. Let's talk next about our recommendations. So at the end of the day, taking all of this into account, should you get the Nikon Z 20mm f1.8? Well, at the moment that I'm publishing this review, it currently costs $1,050 US, which obviously isn't cheap, but it is about what you'd expect for a lens like this, and I'd even say that it's a pretty good value considering how much better this lens is against some others that are way more expensive. But if you're still trying to decide, here's what I'd recommend. At least for landscape photographers, 20mm is an excellent focal length when you need a wide-angle lens, but there still might be cases when you'd want something that's even wider. And if that's the case for you, or if you just prefer a zoom lens for your ultra-wide, I would actually get the 14 to 30mm f4 instead. It is a bit more expensive, but the price is actually going to be about in the same ballpark. And best of all, it's also a native lens for the Z system, so you get those nice benefits like autofocus accuracy, and you don't need to carry around the FTZ adapter. On the flip side, if you need that f1.8 aperture, maybe for Milky Way photography or maybe for something else, the 14 to 30mm f4 obviously wouldn't work. So if that's the case for you, there are still two other main options. The first one is just the DSLR 20mm 1.8, and for that lens, if you already have one, I would consider keeping it and then just adapting it to the mirrorless camera. But I wouldn't go out of my way to buy one for the first time specifically for the Z system. Don't get me wrong, it is still a great lens. It's also a somewhat less expensive lens than the Z20, but there's just so many benefits of this one that I would recommend saving up for it instead, at least if you're a full-time mirrorless shooter. And then the other big competitor out there would be the Z 24mm f1.8. It also has really good performance, only a hair less sharp than the 20, and at the moment that I'm publishing this review, it's actually $50 cheaper. So then the entire question between the two of them is whether you'd prefer 20mm or 24mm. And that's really not something that I can answer for you, but you'll be happy with either of those lenses, so just pick whatever focal length you feel is a better idea for you. Now before I wrap things up, I want to show you a few real-world sample photos from the Nikon Z 20mm f1.8 that I captured while I was working on this review. I think that they reveal a few different things about this lens, so let me jump back to my computer and I'll show you what I mean. And here I am. The first photo that I want to show you is this image that I captured during the previous video of the comet. Now I can zoom in to 100% magnification and you can see that there's a ton of detail in the stars. They're basically points of light and there's almost no smearing even when I look in the corner. In fact, I can zoom this image all the way into 400%, which is the maximum that my software allows, and you can see that the stars still look amazing. There's almost no coma here whatsoever. And that's why I'm comfortable saying that this is one of the best lenses you can get for Milky Way photography. And it's not just the Coma performance, it's also just the maximum aperture. f1.8 lets in more than twice as much light as even f2.8, so you can capture a ton of light with this lens. Now the next thing that I wanted to demonstrate was just focal length, because I mentioned that the new lens has a wider focal length than the old one. And here's the old 20mm lens versus the new one. You can see that's a pretty clear difference, right? The new one is noticeably wider, and admittedly these photos don't have distortion correction turned on, but even if you do turn it on, you'll notice that the new lens is a little bit wider. And it's not really a big deal, but if you are in a tight situation like these slot canyons, you're definitely going to appreciate the slightly wider angle. Now the next thing that I want to demonstrate is simply this photo, not really for any reason other than that I like it. I was really happy that I was able to capture this picture right at sunrise with the moon right above it. But just to make this more of a lens review, I will show you how sharp this photo is. Now I can magnify this image to 200%, even to 400%, and I have incredible sharpness here. There's no blur whatsoever. It really demonstrates one of the key strengths of this lens. Now I do want to point out, in case you're wondering, that none of this review is sponsored. No one's paying me to say anything about this lens, certainly not Nikon, as nice as that would be. So everything that I've said about it is just how I feel. Now, if you've got any questions or comments whatsoever, let me know below. I'm Spencer Cox, and I'll see you next time.